I, some time ago, sent out an invitation, or at least a notice, to a number of people that are involved with this great new book. And we were fortunate enough to be able to have some of those who were here locally, in addition to the Bushmans who are not always here locally, be with us tonight. And we received regrets from several others who were not able to come. But it's kind of fun to have a book like this with numerous contributors that you can get signatures of at least several of them at one time. We don't often have that opportunity. But we want to welcome, in addition to Richard and Claudia Bushman, who it's always a pleasure and a privilege to have them come here. I feel bad because every time Richard sees me, he thinks I'm going to grab him and make him sign books wherever we may be. But I told him that he's on my turf tonight, so he has to sign books. But we're very grateful they've come to talk to us about this festschrift. Now, I'm sure you all knew when you came here what a festschrift was. A book that has gathered contributions, essays in honor of a certain individual usually, and these are essays by a number of leading Mormon scholars in honor of Richard Lyman Bushman. And tonight with us we have Spencer Fluhman and Jed Woodworth, who are two of the editors. Kathleen Flake is back east and not able to come, but she sent her greetings and regards. We also, as I mentioned, have Claudia, who's, I think Richard wants her to do something other than just brag about him, but we'll see what she has to say to us. And also Kate Holbrook, another one of the contributors. So it's a real honor to have them with us tonight. Before we go on, are there any procedural questions or anything anybody has that you're not quite clear on?
Yes, we all heard of the announcement about the new hall you're going to hold these in. We're all really excited.
Well, they were remodeling at the Grand America, or we would have had the Grand Ballroom there.
Amen.
But
there's a donation pot up there.
Yeah, he was asking about the hall that we will want to hire so we can fit everybody in. I'm afraid this is it for now, folks. I know it gets tight, but maybe someday we will need to do that. We did have one off-site once at a library, and unfortunately that night not as many came as we had hoped. But yeah, we realize it's kind of cramped, but we appreciate you putting up with that, and also a little bit of the added temperature that comes with so many bodies being together. I've asked Spencer Fluhman to, since he is the lead editor and was very instrumental in helping this book get done, he's going to introduce those who will be speaking to us, and each one will take a few minutes and talk about either their contribution or some aspect of the book that they wanted to share with us. And the bulk of the time we'll have Richard Bushman speak to us, and he lets me know that might not be a real lengthy period of time, but we will have questions and answers after. Everybody has given their presentation, and so be thinking of good but not necessarily tough questions. I don't know, do we want tough questions? Are we okay? No tough questions. So yeah, be thinking of something you'd like to ask them. I think that I covered most of it. So enjoy. Thank you so much for coming, and we're really glad to have you with us at Benchmark Books, and we want it to be a positive experience, and we'd love for you to come back as often as you can. This is the kind of thing we do, usually up to a couple of times a month as far as events like this, but we're open 6 days a week, and we'd love to have you come and visit. We've got a website, benchmarkbooks.com, phones, everything. So we'd love to have you let us know what it is you're looking for and how we can best help you. So Spencer, I'm going to turn the time over to you, and then we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
So.
Whatever you say.
We'll talk, shall we?
Awkward pause, everyone, please, while we... Good.
Can you hear him?
Can you hear me back there? Okay.
What?
Good. Right on. Good to be here, everyone. I'm Spencer Fluhman. I'm thrilled with this volume, and I'm thrilled to talk about it for just a minute. I hope to get out of the way pretty quickly, but I thought you might be interested in a couple of the things that went into having the volume come about. I'm the executive director of the Neal A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship at BYU, and we published the volume, and I'm the lead editor, and I was there when the idea first happened, so I will tell you that story. The origin story is always important. The idea for the volume came out in a meeting between me and the previous director, Jerry Bradford. Jerry and I were talking. I was reminiscing about the symposium that we did in Richard's honor several years ago. Reed Nielsen and I and Stephen Harper and Jed Woodworth put together a symposium that we held at the Springville Art Museum, and in honor of Richard's 80th birthday, and it was a wonderful time. And Jerry said, "But you didn't have a festschrift come out of it." I said, "Well, no. We had some essays there, and they were put in the Journal of Mormon History." And he said, "But it's not a festschrift." And I said, "Jerry, I'm guessing you want a festschrift." And he said, "Yeah, we need one for Richard." And he said, "Could you pull it off?" And I said, "Absolutely, I'll do it." So I emailed Richard, and Richard said, "No thanks." End of story. No, he said, "No thanks. You did plenty for me when I turned 80. It was a wonderful gesture from you all, and it was a great event, and that commemorative volume of the Journal of Mormon History should suffice." And I said, "Well, we don't want to do anything you don't want, so no problem. Hugs and kisses, Spencer," or something like that. And it was the next day I got a second email from Richard. And the email said, "Actually," he said, "I would be interested if this were an opportunity for Latter-day Saint scholars to reflect on the relationship between their academic life and their life of faith." And I said, "Done. We'll do it." So we conceived of a colloquium that would bring together scholars that Richard has mentored, and that list could have been very, very, very long. So it was a subset of those folks that Richard has had a hand in mentoring, a virtual generation of LDS intellectuals and scholars. And Richard himself insisted that event, he would only be interested in that event if non-Latter-day Saints were there as part of the conversation. So that's what happened. We invited many from the generation of scholars that Richard had mentored, and then we also invited non-LDS commentators who either understood the life of faith or were themselves people of faith in other traditions, to come and engage with and reflect on, comment on those LDS presentations. And so the resulting volume, we decided would be, that the presentations would be brief, that they'd be digestible. They were supposed to be within a certain page range, and as editors we were sticklers for that. So those essays should be digestible, but then each group of essays is introduced by a non-LDS scholar who reflect on the implications of what's there. So in the end, I think this volume is a fitting tribute to Richard, not only in the quality of the thinking, but in its various intersections. The intersection between academic work and discipleship. The intersection between Latter-day Saint thinking and talking and non-LDS conversation partners. And between the intersection between generations that share and give to each other, back and forth, mutually enriched. Late career scholars, early career scholars, mid-career scholars. All of those intersections are on display in the volume, and I think it's a beautiful tribute to the beautiful world that Richard has helped create for folks of my generation. And so it was a proud moment to be able to kind of hand that to Richard through the mail and say, we love you and thank you. And so that's my introduction. And so I think we can, do we have a set idea of who's going to go next? Well, Jed, since you were an editor, maybe you should follow me, and then Kate, and then Phil Barlow, and then the Bushmans at the end. Does that sound okay with everybody? Okay, we'll do that. Thank you.
Well, I was surprised and delighted to be invited to participate on this volume. I could not say no to my mentor and friend, Richard Bushman, who is right behind me. So 6 years ago, Reed Nielsen, my friend and colleague at the Church History Department, called me in Wisconsin, where I was working on my PhD. And he said, Richard is approaching his 80th birthday. We need to have a conference in his honor. And I said, well, that sounds like a great thing. He's certainly deserving of having people come and talk about him and how they've influenced his life. And of course we wanted to get a festschrift out of this. We wanted to take the papers that were given and publish them. And so we came up with this volume. Spencer really was the brains behind getting this published in the Journal of Mormon History as well. It's issue 38, number 3, summer 2012. And we thought that that would be the end of the feeding of Richard Bushman, because not very many scholars get 2 festschrifts instead of 1. You know, in fact, I couldn't name a single one, but he's certainly deserving. He's influenced so many people. And so when I learned about this conference, my mind immediately thought back to what we had done 5 years previously when he turned 80, and I thought, well, what are we going to say now? But it turned out that Spencer and Richard, working together, came up with a great idea that had really not been, it had not been explored to this level of detail. And it's a strange thing to say that it hadn't, because this is really the summum bonum of Richard's scholarly life, is the intersection between faith and reason, and also straddling that world between belief and the Gentile world, as it were. And so I was happy to see this volume come to be. Now, I just wanted to say one thing that I think people don't know about Richard, that I discovered a number of years ago. You know, we are here because of Richard's accomplishments, of his merits, his great writing, his mentoring. But there was actually something early in his career that he decided not to do, that people don't know about, that I find quite interesting. So at one time I was reading Ernest Wilkinson's diary down at BYU. Ernest Wilkinson, the president of BYU for 20 years. And Ernest Wilkinson, in the late 1960s, he was approaching having been president of BYU for 2 decades, and he knew he would be retiring soon, and he knew also that BYU would be turning 100 in 1975. And so he was thinking, who could write a multi-volume history of BYU? And he decided that a young historian on the faculty at BYU named Richard Bushman should be that man to write the history of BYU. And in his diary, he has a couple of entries where he writes about meeting privately with Richard at night. He didn't even go to his office. He wanted to cultivate Richard. I don't remember if it was at Ernest's home or if it was at Richard's home, but Richard can tell us. And what was interesting about the entries is that Ernest Wilkinson was so frustrated that Richard Bushman would not say yes to this project, and that he had the audacity to refuse him. Wilkinson was not a man who easily took no, and he usually got his way, as the history of BYU proves. But Richard was able to say no to that project. And later I went to Richard and I told him about this episode that I learned about in Wilkinson's diary, and I said, how did you manage to to put off Ernest Wilkinson, the great Napoleon, who always gets his way. And he said, you know, I took Robert K. Thomas with me. I made sure that Robert Thomas, who was an academic dean, was in the room so that Wilkinson could not frame the discussion in a certain way or couldn't misrepresent me. I may be putting words in your mouth. You can correct the record here. But so he was not yet 40, yet he had the genius to bring another party into the room to say, I don't want to do this, I'm not trained for this, I'm a colonial historian, not an educational historian. And so I think, well, that's the road that Richard might have taken if he had written the history of BYU. We might not be here tonight. So thank you very much. I forgot this.
Did I move that here? Okay.
Particularly awkward as a woman to have to apply these
Yeah, no, look.
microphones in front of. I think I'll just hold it. I have a tie. As I have cultivated myself as a historian over the past, especially the past 6 years as I've been working at the church history department, I've really come to feel a sense of deep responsibility about the lives that I represent when I write and when I study. Especially because a lot of the people I write about aren't people that other people have written about. So I worry, if I'm the only one, this is the way this person is going down in the record, and I want to get it right. And as often happens in life, when you experience something and haven't articulated it, Richard Bushman may have articulated beautifully what it is you've experienced. And Grant Wacker is the one that captured this quotation of Richard Bushman's. He said, Bushman, just to be clear, someday we will meet in heaven the people we write about. And when we do, we will have to look them in the eye and account for ourselves. Have we told their story as fairly as we know how? Have we told their story without distorting it in order to serve our own agendas? And once I heard that described that way, I found that those two requirements are pretty good at keeping me in a place where I am responsibly accounting for the lives and experiences of the people that I study. Have we told their story as fairly as we know how? Have I told the story without distorting it in order to serve my own agenda, my own political agenda, my own even spiritual agenda, or just wanting my thesis statement to work? So distorting it for that reason. In a book that I worked on that's a collection of women's discourses called At the Pulpit, there's a person who only appears in a footnote. His name was Goliath Kawa, and he lived in South Africa. And Goliath Kawa found an LDS pamphlet, and he founded a church on it. And he had several congregations, hundreds of members of this church. And eventually he wanted to register the name of the church, and he wrote to Spencer Kimball, who was the president of the LDS church at that time. And he said, I tried to register the name of this church. I found out there's already a church with this name. Can we be partners? And I have this many members. And immediately they wanted to send missionaries there, but nobody spoke Xhosa, the language that Nelson Mandela spoke, one of them. And a woman, meanwhile, who'd grown up she'd grown up speaking English and Xhosa in South Africa. She had joined the church, and she decided to serve a mission, and she put in her mission papers and mentioned that she spoke Xhosa, and 2 weeks later, she was in the field with Goliath Kawa, whom they called Bishop Kawa. And they went from congregation to congregation. And he explained to these congregations of people, and he was living off of their tithing, and his family, it was supporting his family. That's the way churches work, often, not the LDS church. And he would say, I baptized you. I've learned I didn't have the right authority to baptize you. And working with the missionaries and this woman, Judy Brummer, they would rebaptize these hundreds of people. Well, in my footnote, I needed to mention that a couple of years after Judy Brummer left her mission, was released from her mission, Goliath Kawa stopped being a church member. And so I went to the mission record, and it said there had been an interview with him, and in the interview he had said, we really only wanted money for drums, and there should be a white church and a black church, and I should be the prophet of the black church. And so just looking at that, I did my best. That's a good primary source to write a footnote, and then I stopped. I said, that's good there. And I didn't feel satisfied with the footnote, but I didn't stop there, or I didn't revisit it. I didn't know what other source to go to. I had to visit Judy Brummer to go over the work I was doing on a talk that she had given. And while I was meeting with her, I had no intention of discussing this footnote because I thought the work was done. But it kept coming up in my consciousness and interrupting my thoughts. And so finally I showed her the footnote. And she said, you know, she broadened my perspective about this man. She said he was a tremendously spiritual man. He was a tremendously generous man. He was willing to give all of these members in this church that was supporting him to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because he believed in the importance of that move for them and for him. And through that conversation, she also told me that the person that had written the mission record that I had used for my source had a personality conflict with Goliath Kawa. So in speaking with her in this way, I came to see I hadn't written the footnote in the right way, and I had risked misrepresenting this man that I don't know that will end up in a lot of other books, if any. I share that story with you because it's an example of me trying to follow Richard Bushman's advice, and because it's an example of me trying to be spiritually in tune in my work as a historian. And when we received this invitation to speak about the intersection of our scholarly and our spiritual lives, that felt a little risky to me. And not everybody really did it in the book, because it does feel a little risky when you're a scholar to also speak about your spiritual life. And I would like to conclude with just a few words about how grateful I am that invitation came my way, and that I was able to experiment with thinking, with writing as both a scholar and a spiritual believer at the same time. Although it's important to know and respect the difference between writing a talk for, say, a church devotional meeting and writing an academic lecture for a university setting, sometimes our efforts to distinguish between different arenas create their own kind of falseness. I am not a Latter-day Saint in the chapel and a parent at the dinner table and a scholar at my computer and while giving a lecture. I am always everywhere a scholar and a Latter-day Saint and a parent. And when I own this and explore it, it improves my scholarship, my discipleship, and my parenting. I believe it would enrich the Academy as a whole if we were to relax these false divides just a little bit. I suppose this is something that anthropologists have been doing, although it's not a discipline teeming with believers. But I think it's a good model, and I'm glad we have a beautiful book now of people experimenting with this approach. Thank you.
Before you start, I apologize for forgetting to introduce Phil to you, Phil Barlow, old friend, and I left him out at the beginning there, so I just wanted to apologize.
No problems. I have a generic face that's forgettable. How are we doing in the back there? Are you making out the talks? Good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, a pleasure to be a part of this volume that was imaginatively conceived to honor Richard. You've heard this pretentious academic term, festschrift, schrift writing, festivizing, someone that is honoring a living figure. I was once in a company with 2 or 3 others with Cynthia Reed, the chief religion editor at Oxford University Press, and someone had broached the idea of a festschrift in honor of someone else. and she spurned that derisively. I hate festschrifts. No one reads them. They're a birthday party for someone, but they're usually not coherent as a volume, just a random collection saying, oh, great one, we honor you, and so I ain't going to publish any. So your attendance here suggests that this book may be a bit of an exception. I hope so. It does have a coherence prompted by Richard, as Spencer described, and the imaginative work of the editors in the hard, not easy work always of putting together a strong conference and these papers deriving. However, Richard's right, I think, as well as it being natural to him to be reticent about being honored and honored and honored some more. Not too many scholars, certainly not too many scholars in the history of the history writing of Mormonism become so significant and impactful that they themselves become part of the story. That is, that's true of Leonard Arrington or Jan Ships or Juanita Brooks or Fawn Brody. A few scholars have done work so impacting that they become a part of Mormon history. Most readers like to read well-written scholarly books if they make a good contribution, but they don't want to read books about the scholars writing the books, sitting at their typewriters or computers, right? So I think both Claudia and Richard are in that rare category where the impact they have had on those around them belongs as part of Mormon history itself. If Claudia's good friend Laurel Ulrich is right with all the t-shirts she has spawned that well-behaved women seldom make history, Claudia is half of a proof and half of a disproof against that assessment, I guess. She's been misbehaved in some ways. If I were writing a word painting of Claudia, she's been ill-behaved to the extent, if by well-behaved Laurel meant shaping oneself entirely into the straitjacketing contours of other people's expectations. Claudia has misbehaved enough to test those boundaries and help erode those boundaries and surround herself along with Laurel and Greta Peterson, another number of other people that we could mention, individuals forming a kind of a molecule that became a seed for a snowflake that became a new element in the universe, and created a faithful, loyal Mormon feminism, not alone and not singularly, but led in that movement that has helped change our consciousness and is part of Mormon history. Richard Grant Wacker, who's a great historian of American religion, recently retired from Duke University, said recently in public that Richard Bushman is one of the two greatest living historians in America. Not historians of Mormonism, but two greatest historians in America. And then he threw out a few teaser jokes so that we could fight about who the other one might be. But that's a sort of stature that he's held in outside Mormon ranks as well as inside Mormon ranks. And he was that well regarded doing work with no specific reference to Mormonism. His first book famously was awarded the Bancroft Prize as the best book in American history, with a few contours of defining what that meant. So he's one of America's most celebrated historians apart from a Mormon topic. In a certain way, in some people's minds, he is one of America's best historians despite his work on Mormonism. He's said out loud before that some people on the search committee at Columbia University when he was given, I think, America's oldest endowed chair in history. Anyway, one of America's most prestigious seats for the practice of history, that they discussed in the search committee before offering him that endowed post, everything about his Mormonism, and it came out, we decided that didn't matter. So despite his Mormon interests in Mormonism, he was so good as to win them over. Then it will need little elaboration here what he has meant to the practice of the study of Mormonism historically itself. So a group of people got together and crafted this volume in his honor to explore faith in relation to scholarship. In my own case, I decided to pick up a theme that I had thought about a good bit because my introduction to Richard Bushman's writing came when I was a college student and read an article that had been written in an early issue of Dialogue back in the 1960s. And it's concluding, it was called Faithful History. Some of you would be familiar with it, others not. And its last line was an inversion of Joseph Smith's famous saying that people can be saved no sooner than they gain knowledge, no faster than they gain knowledge. And Richard brilliantly inverted that to make a corollary assertion and said, we gain knowledge, how to do history as scholars, we gain knowledge no sooner than we are saved. And I've spoken on this in public, including at the symposium from which the book derived, and he kindly and in a fatherly way conveyed something to the effect, if I wasn't misinterpreting you, Richard, son, don't get carried away, allow me a little poetic license in this saying. So where I went in my essay with that thought isn't to be put on Richard's shoulders, but my own reflections in relation to that thought. So my interpretation of it is, and my argument in the chapter is, that character and attitude are intrinsically epistemic. That is, our character and our attitude serves as a filter for what we know. If our character is finer, we can know more, we can be better scholars. The way I've thought about that in a more theological context is that I am smarter when I'm grateful. And the way that works for me is when I'm grateful, I'm full of grace, which is to say, I'm more fully conscious of the grace or giftedness of everything about my life, my opportunities, my capacity to breathe and be. And when I'm more fully conscious of the giftedness of things, I am more alert to the things. I'm so conscious of the gift that when I focus in on a human face, or the greenness of grass, or the wondrousness of a breeze, or the roundness of round, I take all the phenomena of existence less for granted when I'm grateful. It changes my consciousness. So it's not to argue that when I'm grateful or courageous or honest or imaginative, that I'm a better historian of American religion than Perry Miller. It's not to say I'm naturally going to become a better musician than Mozart or a better scientist than Einstein. These people will do good work, so scholarship will happen as scholarship happens. But in relation to the alternate Philip Barlow that I could be if my attitude were different or my character were different, I become a better historian in relation to me. with whatever virtues and attitude I can marshal for the better. And there's ways, I argue in the chapter, that that's true even of scientific endeavors. That's one taste of one sliver of one little contribution to the book. I am honored to be in such company as this, so we'll look forward to hearing from Claudia and Richard. If you like, Kate liked holding it, but you have what passes for a lapel.
Thank you, Phil. I first met Richard Bushman when I was an 18-year-old freshman in college. He was at the time serving as a missionary in the same area, and he was not back for a while. So in the meantime, I got to know him very well by the comments of the people who were already there. Richard Bushman was known as a very brilliant, intense, hard-driving person who did not suffer fools gladly. And when he came back, that seemed well borne out. He would sort of corner me on occasion and demand an answer to something I'd never thought about. I decided he was really a little scary, and I'd better try and stay out of his way. However, for some reason, in some way, we managed to get together. Neither of us can really remember how it happened, but we were suddenly engaged, and then we were married, and now we've been married for more than 62 years. Unbelievable. 62 very productive, useful, satisfying years. And he turned out to be a very different person than I expected that he was. Not nearly as kind of harsh, much more gentle. And maybe not as brilliant, absolutely, though he's got a very good mind. And a very hard-working person. And it's his way of doing things that he takes a topic or a problem or a situation or something and goes right to the heart, looking for the question, the real question to ask about it, and then tries to answer that question. And as he works, and he works hard, and he works hard without having to fight against himself. He naturally works hard. He likes to work hard. But as he is working and thinking about these things, he can hardly read a book through before he digests the ideas that are in it and figures how they'll work into his system and writes down what he thinks about it. He writes even as he researches, and I think that's the very best way. And as we've heard from other people, he has certainly left his fingerprints on Mormon studies. He's also cut a very wide swath through other areas. 2 generations of colonial historians have been influenced by his work. The whole field of material culture has been reimagined since he wrote his book on refinement. I'm waiting to see what happens when his major work on 18th century farming, a topic I know you're all fascinated with, is published in this April or May, something like that, and we'll see what happens to the farmers. After that, he has, as you may know, a book on the cultural meaning of the gold plates, Mormonism's great lost artifact. Well, I bet, people say, well, what does he have to say about that? Well, wait and see. So he has been extremely productive, very useful in lots of fields. And the most recent thing he is working on is the artistic and cultural history of the church. This happened because someone said, when you think about what you're doing, you're not thinking big enough. What would you do if you had $50 million? And he thought about this for some time and then decided what needs to be done is criticism, cultural thinking, all sorts of scholarship on the artistic and cultural history of the church, about which many of us know very little. How many people can name 10 LDS composers? Well, we've already discovered 1,600. And 100 of them have PhDs in music. These are things we don't know, but we should know. And so we're doing art we have the Mormon Arts Center. And if you Google that, you will get our website and see the kinds of things we're doing. We're going to have our second artistic festival in New York last weekend in June. Come. Anyway, what I am saying is, Richard does all kinds of things, does them very well, and he does not do them with personal pride. It's always the pride for the project, the people that he's working. I always use the description that has been used for Sir Galahad. His strength was as the strength of 10 because his heart is pure. So I introduce the pure-hearted Richard Bushman.
Any of those things.
You did well 62 years ago.
Well, what can I possibly say at this point that will live up to this fabulous reputation that I somehow accumulated over the years? I guess all I can say is thank you very much for my good friends who have been associates over the decades. A lot of help from the Church History Library and both Stephen Snow and Reed Nielsen. So my thanks to all of them and to you for coming tonight. And to Kurt Bench, despite the fact that we have an ongoing battle about how many books I have to sign before I can leave and go to lunch. But Kurt, as we know, is really an institution. He's an institution. When the history of the book in Mormonism is written, you have a good page there somewhere, Kurt, in bringing collectors and authors together in this setting as with books overflowing. It's a lovely thing, and in this generation you certainly are our leading bookseller. And of course, as you've heard, I felt like this festschrift really was overdoing it. Not only had there been a birthday party, but there was a session at the American Historical Association about my non-Mormon historical work that was published in Dialogue. So it just seemed like this was far too much. But I was fascinated with the idea of getting our Mormon studies scholars together, my colleagues, my friends, my brothers and sisters, to talk about how their beliefs intersected their writing. And to do this in the presence of non-Mormon scholars. That was the critical point. I wanted them to speak to, not to a Mormon audience, but to a world audience. And I hoped that the presence of these very eminent people would be sobering. It would cause them to think and have to work hard. So that is what persuaded me that something could be done here. And later, I came to realize that the reason this was so appealing to me is that this configuration of scholars in and out of the church was a reprise of my own life. I was asking these scholars to live through what had been sort of the governing, overarching experience of my intellectual growth. I came from a good Mormon family in Portland, Oregon. We were part of the diaspora. My father moved during the Depression because he couldn't get work as a fashion artist in Salt Lake City. So before I went to elementary school, we moved to Portland. I grew up there, went to high school there. And we had a believing family. We were faithful in church. My parents did a lot of church work. During the war, we couldn't get enough gas, so we go to church on the bus. It took us 4 transfers to get from our home to the Colonial Heights ward in Portland. So I was just sort of had it in my bones, and I thought about it. I wanted to be good. I wanted to pray. I wanted God's help. I needed it. as a teenager, I was pretty frail. And so, as circumstance have it, here I am, this Mormon kid, dropped into Harvard College at age 18, into a setting that I never dreamed of, that was foreign and alien to me, but which I greatly loved. I'd never been more myself than I was at Harvard College, beginning in 1949. But it wasn't long before I realized that it was an alien environment as well. This was the age when logical positivism was working its way down to undergraduates. The idea that the only sentences that make sense are those that are based on sensory experience and the logical implications. In other words, what science does. That's the only meaning. And all other statements about things that are not sensed directly were nonsense. And I had to face that. And by the end of my second year, as I was just about to go off to a mission, I came to the conclusion I didn't believe in God, and felt very bad about it. But for some reason went on a mission anyway. Great mystery of my life. Why did I go on a mission? When I told my mission president, when he asked me if I had a testimony, he says, "I don't think I believe in God." And, what I realized afterwards, and I talk about in this essay, in this book, is that I did believe in God. Though I said I didn't. I did believe in God. I'm a believer by nature. I'll always believe in God. I can't live without believing in God. It's just part of me. But I could not find the words to say, to explain what my belief meant at Harvard. I could do it in the Colonial Heights ward. I could do it in my family. I could do it in the group of Latter-day Saints who met each Sunday. We didn't have institute, but we gathered every Sunday to talk about things. I could explain it to them, but I couldn't explain it to my tutor in history and science, which I was studying at that time, or to friends in our endless conversations around the dinner table that went deep into the night. And so I had to say I didn't believe because I couldn't speak. And my whole life has been dedicated to finding a language that I could speak and make sense at Harvard or in the modern academic world, which I chose to join, in which I love and which I admire. I had to find a way to speak faith to skepticism. And I consciously borrow on the more famous phrase, speak truth to power, because for me Harvard was power. It was cultural power, immense erudition, great polish, occupying the heights of the cultural hierarchy, great institutional power, the force of Western learning and art coming down and focusing that institution. That was power, and I had to speak my faith against that great force. And when I was told that Mormonism was garbage, as I was by one of my tutors, even though I was in the presence of that, I didn't want to be bullied. I didn't want to be bullied by Harvard. And so I resisted and tried to find a voice that would make sense, not persuade, not win over, but would just make sense. And it may seem like a simple thing to do, but it took a lifetime. And actually, it's what produced Rough Stone Rolling. The great thing about Rough Stone Rolling is not its learning. There are lots of scholars who know more about Joseph Smith than I do, but its voice. That I was speaking this voice I had learned through these long years of encountering the learned world, as I did wherever I went. And so what I was asking my friends to do was to reenact in some little way, anyway, my experience and my effort, which has sort of occupied my whole life. I thought that they would all have some variant, because what we were doing, I was encountering modernism with its great doubt about the enchantment of the world, its doubt about anything supernatural. I was going up against that great force embodied in Harvard College. And I thought, well, everybody has to face modernism in one way or another, and my colleagues here would find some way of stating it that way. As it turned out, their problems were different than mine, or they shaped them quite differently. Donna Harding talked about being a mother and the wife of an active church leader and trying to have a career. So it was sort of the social history of a mother scholar finding her way in the world. And Kate and everyone else did it their own way. So it wasn't exactly the way I envisioned it coming out, but it's beautiful because it's personal. They're talking right from their hearts. They're talking about their lives and what scholarship means to them, but also what else they're trying to preserve and how this works out. So I want to thank them all. I think any of you who bought the book, and there were, we signed a lot of them today, will find some personal things in there that will be quite enchanting, that they will grip you, and I think you'll enjoy reading it very much. So I'm going to stop at that point. I think, Kurt, are we so far along that we have to avoid questions, or can we take a few?
Well, I wanted to, I couldn't hear him quite when he said, did he say I was an institution or belonged in an institution? The sound cut out a little bit there. We're definitely going to have questions and answers, but I wanted to, I don't know that we mentioned earlier that if you haven't read this book, you have to read this book. It's historical in its nature, but also in what it represents. To have a book that, I don't know, more or less replaces Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, which, done by the same publisher, Alfred A. Knopf.
50 years after.
And her book came out in 1945. It's never been out of print. And I predict that's the same thing that's going to happen here. But this is a groundbreaking landmark biography of Joseph Smith. And Richard has his detractors, and some of them are even in places you wouldn't expect. But it's a very important book that I would highly recommend. But I wanted to also give a nod to Jed Woodworth, who was of invaluable help as a collaborator on this book, and we're glad to have Jed with us tonight too. I just wanted to get that in there. So, Spencer, do you want to kind of field the questions, or do you want to just do that? Okay. I didn't know if he's going to be charging me overtime or not. So please ask your question. We'll go on for a while, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Yes, sir.
Real quickly, about 10 years ago, you spoke at a fireside promoting rough stone rolling up in the Holiday Stake, and I was in attendance, and with the U of U Mormon History Association as well. And I remember at the time, you distinctly said, I think the thing that'll grow people's faith in the church and in the Book of Mormon and in Joseph Smith is studying the translation of the Book of Mormon. You said that was the most faith-promoting thing people could study. I was going to say, 10 years down the road, do you still feel that way? Are there other things that you feel have maybe built your faith over the last decade as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, I still think the Book of Mormon is a formidable presence, literary presence in American culture. And very difficult to understand. You used the word translation. I'm not sure I used that initially. I may have. But there's been a lot of work done on translation. Sam Brown sitting back here is working on that subject. There are there are others, and it's very complex, and it's getting more complex by the minute. You know, it's getting harder and harder to say how that translation worked. So I'm not sure the translation itself will be something that will overcome people. The Book of Mormon is one of the most complex texts in our in existence, and one of the most mysterious texts. I think will remain something that scholars will have to contend with. I was asked to give a session at the intellectual history seminar at Harvard about 5 or 6, maybe 1905, 2005, 2006, somewhere along there. And I was trying to make the case it deserved to be studied and hadn't been studied adequately. It should be brought into the canon of essential Mormon works. And there was a very sharp kid there. He was teaching at MIT. He was a graduate student at Columbia when I was teaching there. And he said, "Yes, Professor Bushman, but if we're going to teach that work, the Book of Mormon, what is the work that you signed before the Book of Mormon, and what is the work you assigned after? In other words, where does it fit in the flow of historical elements?" And that was a very interesting question. He could not think of an answer. He was a very learned man, which means that somehow the Book of Mormon is slightly out of history. We hunt through and try to find all the things that are 19th century, and there are a lot of them. I'm not saying they're not there. But as a text that does this and that, it's very mysterious. I think that Jared Hickman is probably going to do a good job on it. Jared Hickman's current project is on the Book of Mormon, and his aim is to show that it may be the central text in Western civilization, not Western history, in Western civilization, in sort of expressing the forces that were at work in transatlantic culture. So I think in one way or another it's going to remain sort of a growing intellectual force that we will have to find ways to deploy for our best advantage. I'm a little too long there. No more questions. Here's what.
What are other faith-promoting experiences other than the bringing forth of the Book of Mormon?
Pardon?
What are the other faith-promoting experiences that were a tremendous influence in your life other than bringing forth of the Book of Mormon?
The question is, what were other experiences that were important to me? When you use that word, you're asking me to bear my testimony in a classic way. Sometime when I prayed, the Spirit of the Lord flowed into me. I was overwhelmed and felt that this is the truth. And when I went in the mission field and told my mission president that I didn't sure I believed in God, he says, "Well, would you read this book and give me an explanation for it?" Handed me the Book of Mormon. Sent me from Cambridge, Mass, up to Halifax, and that was the end of our conversation for the time being. And so I wrestled with the Book of Mormon. 3 months later, he came up to conference, to Halifax for a missionary conference, and asked everyone to bear their testimony. And I stood up and said, "I know the Book of Mormon is right." Something had happened to me after all my doubts. I wrestled all that time. I was asking every hard question I could think of. Were the witnesses all befuddled by Joseph Smith? Were they hypnotized? Were they in on the scam? Da-da-da-da. Writing in my journal furiously, trying to figure it out. After 3 months, I knew the Book of Mormon was right. So I had that kind of experience. But my testimony, I have multiple testimonies. They mean many, many things to me. But the one, and I don't use the word "no" very much. I don't like that word. It's misleading, I think, personally. You use it, it's fine with you. But what I am willing to say I know is I know that I'm a better man when I live the Mormon way. No question about that. I'm a better husband, better father, better scholar, better teacher. I do everything better when I'm doing it right. When I was finishing Joseph Smith, I was called to be a temple worker. We newly had a